I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though 5 years have passed. The family reunion was at my uncle's house, a big Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, and everyone had dressed up for the occasion. My stepmother had on her fancy dress, the one she only wore to special events, and my father kept checking his phone to see what time the photographer would arrive. I'd spent an hour curling my hair that morning, working hard to make each ringlet perfect, hoping that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time I'd finally feel like I belonged in this world they'd all created without me. I was 16 years old and desperate to be part of something that actually felt real and lasting. My step-siblings were laughing in the corner, already comfortable with each other like they always were, sharing inside jokes and memories I'd never be part of. I stood near the window, watching the afternoon light pour in through the glass, feeling invisible before anyone had even asked me to leave. The worst part wasn't knowing what was coming, it was hoping it wouldn't happen, even though deep down, I already knew. When the photographer arrived, he was a tall man with a camera that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe. Everyone scrambled into position like they'd been waiting their whole lives for this moment. Cousins, aunts, uncles, everyone had a place, a spot where they belonged. I walked over slowly, trying to figure out where I fit in the formation. My mother, who had raised me alone for the first 12 years of my life, had passed away when I was very young. The cancer came fast, and then she was gone, leaving a hole in my life that nothing could fill. My father had remarried 5 years earlier, just 1 year after she died. Since then, I'd been trying to find my place in this new family structure, this blended family that seemed to blend everything except me. The photographer started arranging people, moving them left and right, positioning them so the light hit their faces perfectly. I waited patiently, thinking I'd finally be included in something that mattered, something that would prove I was part of this unit. Then my stepmother turned and looked at me with cold, empty eyes that made my stomach drop. "Let's take one of just the family first," she said to the photographer, her voice casual and light, as if she was asking him to adjust the camera angle. Her tone wasn't mean or angry, it was worse. It was dismissive, like I was nothing but a piece of furniture she wanted moved out of the way. I watched them gather together, smiling brightly at the camera like they were the happiest people in the entire world. Their arms wrapped around each other, their heads tilted together, their faces glowing with joy. Click, click, click. The photographer captured everything, their happy faces, their arms around each other, their perfect unity, and I wasn't in any of it. Not a single frame. My father never looked at me, never acknowledged that I was even standing there. He just smiled for the camera like I didn't exist. My stepmother adjusted her hair, checking her reflection in a nearby mirror, completely focused on how she looked rather than how I felt. My step-siblings grinned like this was the greatest moment of their lives, like they'd never been happier than they were right now, together, without me. After the photos were finished, the photographer started to pack up his equipment, and my stepmother turned to me with that same empty smile. "You can go help in the kitchen if you'd like," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. As if I hadn't just been rejected in front of everyone. As if my feelings didn't matter at all. As if I was something to be managed rather than someone to be loved. I nodded without saying anything, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt, and walked away with tears burning the back of my eyes. The ride home was silent in a way that only a car full of family can be silent. My father drove with his hands gripping the steering wheel at exactly 9 and 3 o'clock, staring straight ahead at the road without really seeing it. My stepmother sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through the photos on the camera with her perfectly manicured nails, laughing with my step-siblings about how good everyone looked. "These are going to look amazing on social media," she kept saying, her voice light and happy, as if she hadn't just humiliated her stepdaughter in front of the entire extended family. "We need to find the perfect filter, the perfect caption. This is going to get so many likes." I sat in the back seat, pressing my face against the cold car window, watching the world blur past in shades of gray and green. The trees seemed to lean away from us as we drove by, as if they too were rejecting me. No one asked me how I felt. No one acknowledged what had happened. No one said, "Maria, that was mean, and we're sorry." It was as if the whole thing was normal, as if excluding me from our family photo was just something that happened sometimes, like the weather or traffic. It was as if I'd never existed at all. The next morning, I found the photo online before I even had breakfast. My stepmother had posted it before the sun came up, and it already had 47 likes and 17 comments. The caption made my heart drop into my stomach like a stone sinking in water. Family forever, so grateful for these amazing people in my life. Nothing beats quality time with the ones you love. I stared at the image on my phone screen, looking at all of them smiling together, their arms linked, completely whole and complete. And I wasn't there. I had been digitally erased from their lives, made into nothing but empty space. I showed up to family breakfast the next morning as if nothing had happened, as if my world hadn't just cracked in half. My stepmother was making pancakes, humming to herself like she was the happiest woman alive. My father was reading the newspaper, safe behind the pages. My step-siblings were arguing about something stupid, something that didn't matter at all. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. I asked my father quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, why I had been left out of the photo. He wouldn't look at me. Instead, he stared at his eggs like they were the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. It wasn't a big deal, Maria, he said, his words landing like punches. Don't make drama about it. That's not the kind of person we want in our family. My stepmother turned from the stove, a pancake spatula in her hand, and smiled that awful smile that I would come to hate more than anything in the world. You should have been faster, she said casually, flipping another pancake. Those 5 words broke something inside me that I'm not sure was ever fully repaired. They were so simple, so casual, but they contained the entire weight of my rejection. She was right, in a way. If I'd been faster, more aggressive, more willing to push myself into spaces where I wasn't wanted, maybe I could have forced myself into the photo. But I wasn't that kind of person. I'd been raised to be gentle and to accept rejection quietly. I left the table without saying anything else, my appetite completely gone. I went to my room, closed the door, and sat on my bed for a long time, just staring at nothing. Then I pulled out my phone. I deleted every social media account I had. I deleted my Instagram with its carefully curated photos. I deleted my Facebook with all its memories and connections. I deleted my TikTok, my Twitter, everything. I wanted to erase myself from the digital world the same way they'd erased me from their photo. That night, I looked at that old photo one last time, burned it into my memory so I would never forget what they'd done to me. Then I promised myself something that would sustain me through the darkest years ahead. One day, they would see me. One day, I would be so successful, so important, that they couldn't ignore me anymore. One day, I would make them regret everything they'd done. I made it through the last year and a half of high school like a ghost moving through a haunted house. I showed up, did my homework, answered when teachers called on me, but otherwise kept to myself. I ate lunch alone in the library. I avoided school events and parties. I became invisible by choice, deciding that if they didn't want to see me, I wouldn't give them the chance. When I graduated, I told my father I was moving out. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't argue or plead or try to convince me that things could be different. He just nodded like he'd been expecting this moment all along, like he'd known our relationship was too broken to repair. I packed a single suitcase with clothes, a laptop that I'd saved up for over 2 years, and some cash I'd accumulated from working part-time jobs at the grocery store. I had maybe $2,000 to my name. No safety net. No real plan. Just determination and anger and the burning need to prove something to people who probably didn't even think about me. I moved into a small apartment above a local cafe in the downtown area, a place that was affordable because the walls were thin and the heating barely worked. But it was mine. On my first day in my new apartment, I looked for work immediately. I got a job at the cafe downstairs, working the morning shift, making lattes for business people and cappuccinos for students. The owner was a kind older man named Paul who'd run the cafe for 20 years and genuinely cared about his employees. He paid minimum wage, which wasn't much, but he was fair and he didn't judge me for being quiet or for the sad look in my eyes. Every night, after the cafe closed at 6 o'clock, I'd walk 3 blocks to a print shop that was struggling to stay afloat, its windows dusty and its signage faded. The print shop was called Family Print and Design, which I didn't even notice at first because I was too focused on survival. The owner, a guy in his 60s named Walter, was looking for someone to work nights and was willing to pay under the table if needed. He didn't care about my experience because I didn't have any. What he cared about was that I showed up on time and worked hard. Walter taught me everything over the next 2 years: how to operate the massive printing machines without getting my fingers caught, how to understand design files and spot errors before they ruined an entire batch, how to deal with difficult clients who wanted the impossible, how to turn a struggling business into something that actually worked and made people happy. Walter became like the father figure I'd never really had after my mother died. He believed in me when nobody else did. He'd watch me design a layout or fix a printing error and nod approvingly. "You've got a real eye for this," he'd say. "Not everyone can see the way shapes and colors work together. You have that gift." I'd beam at these compliments because they meant something, because they came from someone who actually cared about my future. For 2 years, I worked 2 jobs and learned more than I ever could have in a classroom. I learned about color theory and paper quality. I learned about deadlines and customer service and the art of negotiation. I learned about myself, that I was stronger than I'd ever believed, that I could survive on very little, that I didn't need my family to validate my worth. Then, one day, Walter told me he was retiring. He'd had a health scare, nothing too serious, but it made him want to slow down and spend time with his family. He said he wanted to sell me the shop. He'd been losing money for years, he explained, but with the right person running it, it could turn around. He'd cut me a deal. I could buy it for half of what it was actually worth. The offer was almost too good to be true. I'd have to take out a small business loan, use every cent I'd saved, and probably eat nothing but ramen noodles for years. But the shop would be mine. For the first time in my life, something would truly be mine in a way that nobody could take away from me. I signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in Walter's office, my hands shaking as I held the pen. When I walked back to look at the storefront, I noticed the sign for the first time. I really looked at it. Family Print and Design. I laughed, actually laughed out loud, at the cruel and beautiful irony of the universe. Here I was, building something called family, something that would sustain me and give me purpose, when my own flesh and blood family had thrown me away like I was garbage. The sign almost felt like a cosmic joke, a gift from the universe that it was saying, "This is your real family. This work is your real home." I promised myself that night that I would make this business thrive. I promised that I would prove every single person who'd ever doubted me wrong. The first year of owning the shop was brutal in ways I can barely describe. I barely slept, living on 5 or 6 hours a night, sometimes less. I printed business cards and flyers and promotional materials for whoever would hire me, even if the profit margin was tiny. I stood on street corners handing out flyers to people who mostly ignored me. I created a basic website that took me 3 months to learn how to do and started running ads online with money I could barely afford to spend. I ate instant noodles for dinner almost every single night, sometimes for breakfast and lunch too. My diet consisted of ramen, water, and the occasional apple from the discount bin at the grocery store. My apartment was just a place to sleep for 4 or 5 hours before I had to go back to work. There were nights when I questioned everything, when I wondered if I was absolutely crazy for giving up any kind of normal life for this dream that might never come true. But there were also moments when I'd be in the shop late at night, designing something beautiful, creating something that people would treasure, and I'd feel this sense of purpose that I'd never felt before. About 14 months into owning the shop, a woman walked through my door on a regular Tuesday afternoon. She was dressed in expensive clothes, designer purse, jewelry that looked real, nails that must have cost more than my daily food budget. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from always getting what you want in life and never being told no. She had an order, 300 anniversary cards for a family celebration happening in 2 weeks. She explained what she wanted with the tone of someone used to being obeyed: high-quality cardstock, gold foil detailing on the edges, and a family photo printed on the front. She wanted them professional, elegant, perfect. I quoted her a price that seemed fair but would actually make me some real profit, enough to pay the next month's rent and buy some groceries that weren't instant noodles. She barely looked at me when she agreed. She just handed over the photo file on a USB drive and left without even saying goodbye. That night, after she'd gone, I opened the file on my computer. And my entire world stopped moving. It was the photo, the one from 5 years ago. The one that had excluded me and broken my heart. The one that had crystallized everything I felt about my place in the world. The one where I was nowhere to be found. I pulled up the file and confirmed all the details with trembling hands. The names were right. My father's name was on the invitation. My stepmother's name was there. The date was their anniversary party, happening in just over 2 weeks. My hands shook as I read the order form again and again. The woman's last name was Williams, my stepmother's maiden name. She'd kept using it professionally, it seemed. I sat in the darkness of my print shop, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my ribs and fall onto my desk. The universe had just handed me an opportunity that I couldn't have orchestrated even if I'd tried, even if I'd spent years planning it. I whispered the words out loud to the empty shop. They just gave me their order. I laughed then, a strange, hysterical kind of laugh that came from deep inside my chest, from the wounded part of me that had been waiting 5 years for this moment. I thought about it for a solid hour, spinning scenarios in my head like they were on a carousel. I could cancel the order and pretend there was a problem. I could ruin this for them, make them suffer the way they'd made me suffer. I could sabotage the cards in some obvious way that would leave no doubt about my involvement. They would know it was me, and they would finally understand what it felt like to be humiliated in front of everyone you love. I could replace their family photo with something embarrassing. I could blur their faces. I could do 1,000 terrible things. The temptation was almost overwhelming, like a physical force pressing against my chest. Every time I thought about what my stepmother had said to me, every time I remembered my father's silence, I felt this hot, burning anger rise up in my chest like a tide. But then I remembered something Walter had told me once when I was particularly angry about life. Success is the best revenge, he'd said, his voice wise and calm. Don't get even. Get better. Build something so good that they can't help but admire you. I realized that what I was actually angry about wasn't this one photo or this one event anymore. It was so much bigger than that. For 3 days, I wrestled with what I wanted to do, barely sleeping, going over the possibilities in my mind. I thought about canceling the order completely and burning that bridge forever. I thought about printing the cards with their faces blurred out. I thought about replacing their family photo with an empty template, something blank and meaningless. The temptation was constant and overwhelming. Every time I looked at that photo file, I felt something dark and powerful inside me that I didn't even know existed. But then I remembered something else Walter had said: the best lesson you can teach someone is to let them live with the consequences of their own choices. I realized that what I was actually angry about was every time they'd made me feel small, every time they'd chosen each other over me, every time they'd acted like I didn't exist. And I suddenly understood exactly what I needed to do. Not to hurt them, but to teach them. Not to get revenge, but to make them see. I would give them exactly what they'd ordered. I printed everything perfectly, working late into the night, making sure every single detail was flawless. The cardstock was beautiful, thick and expensive, the kind that felt good in your hands. The gold foil was flawless, catching the light beautifully. The layout was professional and elegant, exactly what they'd requested. And then I did something that required a level of nerve I didn't even know I possessed. I switched out the photo file on their proof. Instead of their family photo on the front of the cards, where their smiling faces should have been, I replaced it with a blank template. The cards were absolutely perfect in every other way: the design, the quality, the printing, the colors, everything. But where their smiling faces should have been looking out at their guests, there was just elegant white space. Blank. Empty. Nothing. I made 300 blank cards and printed every single one of them. Then I created a PDF proof and reviewed it carefully, checking it multiple times to make sure I hadn't made any mistakes. 300 perfect, professional-looking cards with absolutely nothing on them. I double-checked everything. The proof was clean. The colors were right. The dimensions were correct. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the one thing that mattered most. Delivery day came on a Friday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after she'd first walked into my shop. I drove to their house myself in my old, beat-up car that I'd bought used for $300. The 300 cards were packed neatly in a professional box, wrapped with a ribbon like they were something precious. I wore simple clothes and a baseball cap pulled low, even though I knew my stepmother probably wouldn't recognize me. 5 years had passed since that family reunion. I'd cut my hair short and started dressing differently. I was taller now, more confident, completely different from the sad, invisible girl I'd been. My stepmother answered the door on the third ring, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. She looked older than I remembered, with lines around her eyes and a tightness to her mouth that hadn't been there before. Had I done that to her? Had my pain somehow aged her? She signed the invoice without even looking at me. She barely looked at the box either, just took it from my hands and nodded. "Thanks for the rush job," she said, still not really seeing me. I nodded and turned to leave, my heart pounding in my ears so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I waited for 5 days before the voicemail came, 5 days of checking my phone constantly, 5 days of wondering if something had gone wrong. When my phone rang and I heard her voice, shaking with fury and barely controlled panic, I already knew what was coming. "You send us blank cards," she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking. "Every single one. Do you understand what you've done? Our anniversary party is tomorrow. What kind of company sends out blank cards? This is a disaster. This is absolutely unacceptable. I'm going to report you. I'm going to make sure nobody ever uses your company again." I let her finish, her voice getting higher and more frantic with each word. Then I called her back, using the most professional, sympathetic tone I could manage, the tone I'd learned from Walter. "I'm so sorry to hear you're unhappy with your order," I said calmly. "May I ask, did you approve the final proof before we printed?" There was a pause. A long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "Well," she stammered, "yes, but then the cards reflect exactly what you approved," I said, keeping my voice level and reasonable. "If there's an issue with the design, it would have shown in the proof. Perhaps you'd like to review your file?" I hung up after that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her of anything. I just hung up, sat in my shop, and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was absolute chaos and panic. My stepmother called back 17 times over the next 2 hours. She left voicemail after voicemail, each one more hysterical than the last. She demanded a refund. She threatened to report me to the Better Business Bureau and every business licensing agency she could find. She said she'd tell everyone she knew that my company was a scam, a fraud, that I'd deliberately sabotage her order. I responded to each message with professional courtesy and factual statements. Yes, she had approved the proof. No, I could not refund her because the cards were exactly as approved. No, there was no legal basis for a complaint because the delivered product matched the approved design. It was all facts, all perfectly defensible. Within 48 hours, the family had scrambled to get replacement cards printed at a cheap, local printer, and those cards were terrible quality. But because everything had been rushed, the replacements had printing errors. Some were smudged. Some were cut wrong at the edges. And because they'd been ordered so last minute, not all of them arrived in time for the party. Social media started buzzing about their fancy anniversary party where guests received damaged or missing invitations. People were confused and amused by the whole situation. The story spread like wildfire. About a week later, a man stormed into my shop, his face red with anger. I recognized him immediately as my stepbrother, Paul. He'd grown since I'd last seen him, maybe 4 years ago, and his face was twisted with fury and betrayal. "You did this," he shouted at me, his voice echoing through the empty shop. You sabotaged Mom's card order. Don't even try to deny it. I stayed calm, a calmness that came from knowing I was right. I was standing behind my counter, working on a design for another client, my hands steady and my voice even. I looked at him directly, making eye contact in a way that said I had nothing to hide. You came to my company and received my work. I printed exactly what you approved. If you have a problem with your order, I'd be happy to help you figure out what went wrong. He realized in that moment that I was serious, that I wasn't going to break down or admit to anything, and that legally, there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. I could see the moment it dawned on him that the woman who'd picked up that order was me, that his sweet stepsister had grown up and become someone with power. He stormed out without another word, and I went back to my design work, my hands still steady. My father called me 3 days later, his voice heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. How could you do this to us? He asked, and I felt something shift inside me when I heard those words. Disappointment. As if my success and my choice to let them experience consequences was somehow disappointing to him. How could I? I repeated quietly, and I realized I was crying. Dad, how could you erase me from every photo and still call it family? How could you stand there and let her humiliate me, not once, but over and over again? I was your daughter. I was supposed to matter to you. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Real silence. Not angry silence, but the kind of silence that comes when someone finally understands something they've been avoiding for years. For the first time in years, my father had no defense. He had no excuse. He couldn't minimize my feelings or tell me I was being dramatic or pretend that what had happened wasn't real. I heard him take a shaky breath. Then he said, I don't know what to say, Maria. I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you. I should have been a better father. After we hung up, I sat in my shop and let myself remember everything that had happened and everything I'd become. I thought about my childhood before my mother died, the warmth and safety I'd felt before everything changed forever. I thought about the years after my father remarried, the slow realization that I didn't belong in this new family structure, the way I'd tried so hard to be good and quiet and invisible, hoping that would somehow make me acceptable to them. I thought about that family photo, how it had crystallized everything I felt, that I was fundamentally unwanted, that some families could just decide to erase you, and that there was nothing you could do about it. And then I thought about my journey since then, the long and difficult journey that had brought me to this point. I thought about how I'd built something real and successful with my own 2 hands, building it from nothing. I thought about the clients who came back again and again because they trusted my work and valued my integrity. I thought about Walter, who had believed in me when I had nothing and nobody else in the world. I realized that my revenge wasn't just about getting even anymore. It was about something deeper and more meaningful. It was about closure. It was about proving to myself that I could take the thing that had broken me and transform it into fuel for something better. It was about showing myself that I was no longer that invisible girl who begged to be included in their world. The blank cards weren't really about hurting them anymore. They were about showing myself that I was Maria, and I had built my own empire. The media attention kept building and growing. People loved the story, once they started piecing it together from various sources. The girl who'd been excluded finally making her mark. The company that had rejected her accidentally working with her and getting what they deserved. My shop started getting new clients, including some from my stepmother's social circle who thought the whole situation was hilarious. I overheard one of them talking to another customer, you know, that's the girl who sent the blank cards. Isn't she clever? And she'd winked at me like we were sharing a secret. That wink meant something. It meant I was finally visible. About 2 months after the whole incident, my father showed up at my shop on a quiet Thursday afternoon. He came in during the afternoon, when business was slow, and asked if we could talk in the back room. I was nervous about what he'd say, what he wanted, whether he was going to ask me to apologize or fix things somehow or make the whole situation go away. But instead, he just looked around my shop, really looked at it, and his eyes got wet with tears. I'm sorry, he said simply, and those 2 words seemed to contain years of regret. I'm sorry for what we did to you. I'm sorry for letting your stepmother treat you that way. I'm sorry for pretending it didn't matter. And I'm sorry it took this long for me to actually see you. I didn't know what to say. An apology from him was something I'd wanted for so long, but I'd stopped expecting it years ago. He continued, his voice shaking, "Your stepmother is ashamed. She knows what she did was wrong. But more than that, I'm ashamed. I failed you as a father." He asked if I would come to dinner. He asked if I would consider trying to rebuild our relationship, even if it was different now. I agreed, mostly because I was curious what it would be like and because somewhere deep down, I realized I'd been waiting for this moment too. The evening was awkward at first, filled with tension and uncertainty. My stepmother kept forcing smiles and compliments. "We're so proud of what you've become," she said stiffly, her words sounding rehearsed. I looked her in the eye and smiled back, my voice steady. "You should be," I said. "You printed my name on every invoice." Everyone at the table went very quiet. My step-siblings didn't know what to say. My stepmother's face flushed red. My father closed his eyes for a moment, and I wasn't sure if he was angry or sad or relieved that I was finally being honest. But I wasn't trying to be mean anymore. I was just stating a fact. I had built something real and lasting, and she'd been part of that story, whether she'd meant to be or not. After dinner, as we were leaving, I walked past the living room. The family photo from that reunion was still hanging on the wall, exactly where it had been for 5 years. I stopped and looked at it, really looked at it, for the first time since high school. It didn't hurt anymore. That was the most surprising part. Looking at that photo, seeing myself excluded from it, it just felt like looking at a chapter from someone else's life story. My stepmother came and stood next to me. "I've thought about taking that down," she said quietly. "Why haven't you?" I asked. "I wasn't sure I had the right," she answered. I nodded and walked over to the hallway, where my father had hung some photos of my shop. They were recent pictures, me cutting the ribbon at the shop opening with Walter standing beside me with my staff on our first anniversary, me accepting an award for Best Local Print Company. "These are my family now," I said, more to myself than to her. "Not in the way you meant it, but in the way that actually matters. These are the people who chose me." When I got home that night, I took out my phone and looked at a photo I'd taken that morning. It was my entire staff standing in front of my shop, with the logo clearly visible, Family Print and Design. These were my people. This was my family. If this story moved you, if you felt Maria's pain, cheered for her strength, and realized that your own power is waiting for you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because the best stories are the ones that remind us that we have the power to rewrite our own endings. These are the stories that deserve to be heard, the stories that change lives and inspire us to become more than we ever thought possible. Don't miss a single chapter of the stories that can transform how you see yourself and the world around you. Subscribe now and let's keep building this community together. Together, we are stronger. Together, we are unstoppable. Thank you for watching.